Well, this evening we are continuing on with our series, our post-pandemic series, anticipating this time. We're hoping soon when the pandemic's over, and asking the question, having survived the pandemic, now what? And I said before that that's really a wisdom question for us. Living rightly or living the best way, that's really a wisdom question. That's how the Bible would approach that issue, as something that we need wisdom about. It's not necessarily about what is right and wrong. It's not a moral issue. It's about what is best. And so it makes sense that we would turn, at least for one Sunday, to one of the wisdom books in the Old Testament. And Ecclesiastes is a favorite of mine. So I want you for a moment to imagine yourself sitting on a park bench, and it's lunchtime, and you've gone to a duck pond not too far from your work to enjoy the sunshine and the ducks swimming around and eat your lunch. And another man sits beside you, and he pulls out his brown bag, and he's doing the same thing. And so you're casual conversation, but you're trying to mind your own business a bit too. And so you're not, watching him too hawkishly till he pulls out an orange. And you're trying not to stare, but it's kind of difficult because you realize right away something kind of strange is going on here. He takes the orange and bites into it, just like an apple. And you can tell there's something strange about this guy. Like he's never eaten an orange before, because he immediately starts to grimace and make a terrible face. And you can see he's working at chewing it. And finally, he just spits it out. And says, "Oh, that's disgusting." And he takes the nearly perfectly good orange and he tosses it into the duck pond. "Oh, I'm not eating that. That was awful." And you're probably thinking a few things at that point. What an idiot. Haven't you ever eaten an orange before? Maybe even thinking, what a waste. But I want you to picture that scene as we get into the book of Ecclesiastes here, because I think that's how a lot of people approach this book. This book of Ecclesiastes is that orange. I think for a lot of people, they figure they can kind of dive into Ecclesiastes pretty much like any other book of the Bible, indeterminately, just kind of open it up, take a mouthful, and chew on it and get something sweet and satisfying. And they find out that actually there's a lot mixed in there that isn't that sweet, that at least on the surface isn't that satisfying. Some people succeed by chance, but I think for us to get sort of the whole picture, we have to understand Ecclesiastes really in its entirety, even if we're going to just be looking at one small section, chapter 3, this evening. So like an orange, it has to be peeled. There's a sort of a hard, bitter outer rind that has to be peeled away from the book of Ecclesiastes. It's there for a reason, but it's not maybe there for us to delight in the same way. An orange has to be peeled, and is best when we enjoy it section by section. And so too with Ecclesiastes. That's how we have to approach it if we want to get to something that, as Paul says to Timothy, is rightly divided for us. So we read the passage of chapter 3, but like I said, I think we have to have in perspective the entire book of Ecclesiastes. Really, I think when you approach any part of the book, and chapter 3 is no exception. So how are we going to make sense of Ecclesiastes? First off, I think we have to understand that it was an oral book. It has an oral nature. It was meant to be spoken aloud. The title Ecclesiastes actually literally means one who speaks to an assembly or even to a church or a synagogue. And sometimes it's translated as a preacher. You might see that in chapter 1. And that's not too far off. Actually, the book of Ecclesiastes in the tradition of Israel was read at the Festival of Booths in its entirety before the people of Israel. And if you were to read through the entire book that way or listen to it aloud, you would hear that, yes, there are a lot of devices in it that make sense if you're going to be listening to it rather than reading it. There's a lot of repeated phrases. Meaningless, meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Or if you're more familiar with the King James, vanity of vanities. There's several themes that keep coming up again and again, and we keep getting drawn back to. So that's part of the oral nature of the book as well. It's all and then chapter 1 verse 2 and chapter 12 verse 8 sort of form bookends to the book, which makes sort of it's a very common rhetorical device that a public speaker would use in the time that this was written. So this all kind of points us to this oral nature of it. So what does that mean for us? Well, I think it means we have to adjust our expectations a bit. Mother's Day is coming up, and I am really curious how Google figured this out about me. But I was noticing just the other day, I was looking for, I'd Googled Mother's Day to make sure I had the date right in May, because that's kind of a good first step. And I Googled that, and then right on the side, the ads that came up, like there's, a little locket or something like that, and then there was like 4 identical ads for a book of poetry written by Donald Trump. I thought, okay, that's kind of a strange Mother's Day gift. I will not be getting my mother that. If she's watching, she can breathe a sigh of relief later, I guess. But yeah, well, I had to look because it just made me curious. And then I saw, okay, yeah, it's edited by somebody else. So I think they've taken like speeches and tweets and things and tried to arrange them into something, approaching poetry. And if you've ever actually read one of Trump's speeches that he gave during the course of his presidency, you quickly appreciate that it's like what might actually work kind of live and in person and in public speaking, it takes on a different tone in the written word. And for Trump, a lot of the time, it really doesn't work. It almost comes out as gibberish. But I think we have to kind of go through a similar mental mechanic when we come to the book of Ecclesiastes. We always have to remember, okay, this was somebody speaking this out loud. So it just kind of has a different tone and timbre to it than we would normally associate with, something like, say, the book of Romans. That's really tightly reasoned. We can't approach it in quite the same way. So we adjust our expectations. But we're still kind of left with a question. How do we make sense of the book? In some ways, when we read it, it seems haphazard in its arrangement. It seems contradictory in some of its perspectives. How do we make sense of that? Well, my first answer to that is to affirm that Ecclesiastes really does follow a pattern. And it may not be one that we're accustomed to, though. And so I think we can still rely on that. The structure of the book of Ecclesiastes is analogous, like I said, to an orange. So there's this hard outer rind, and then inside, I think there's as we go through the book, if we were to go through it chapter by chapter, you see that there's sections in it. Sort of almost self-contained units all throughout the book. And it's not a usual argument that we're used to. Like if you go to the New Testament and you read Paul, he's very logically reasoned, and so he will sort of, A plus B equals C sort of argument flow to it. But the preacher of Ecclesiastes kind of goes at it differently. We take out one section, we examine it, and then we put it back, and we realize there's kind of a theme with it. We come to the next one. And the next one doesn't necessarily build off of what we've just read, and it's not necessarily leading us into the next thing either. But we take it out, we examine it, and we see that it has a theme. And as we go through the whole book, we discover that there's a common thread going through all of it. And we're going to see that it's in chapter 3 as well. It's talking about how do we live a life that is truly satisfying? How do we live a life that's truly satisfying? And I think that's an important consideration at any time, but especially as we kind of come out of the pandemic. We're looking, again to get into to figure out what's the best life that I can lead now, because I think we're all going to be have a few moments, maybe a few months of being fairly aware of the decisions we're getting back into. It gives us an opportunity to kind of kickstart things. And so it's helpful to ask that question, how can I live a life that is satisfying? How can I live a life that is worthy of the Lord? And that's what we're going to be examining tonight. So, as I said, the sections don't really necessarily build off of each other. They're a little more of self-contained units. The book is also like an orange in that I've referenced a couple times. It has a hard outer layer. That outer layer is this message of meaningless, everything is meaningless. I always enjoy a commentator, a scholar of the Bible that can put it in understandable terms for me. He says that, I was reading one this week that said that word vanity literally means like a theological fart. Your life is a fart. And maybe it's a vulgar way of putting it. But I think it gets at the core of this unpalatable and hard truth that the preacher is bringing to us that we don't really want to hear. That there is sort of a meaninglessness to life if we start to think about it. And we're going to see it in chapter 3 as well. But that's the harder outer rind. It expresses sort of the extent of what the author wants to say, but then inside of that, like an orange, there's a sweet inner fruit. And it's expressed several places in the book of Ecclesiastes, but we heard it tonight in chapter 3 in verse 12. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This, too, I see is from the hand of God. In that context there, it talks about, we should enjoy our toil. Eternity is in our hearts. We want to do something permanent and long-lasting with our lives. But he says, really, you need to learn to enjoy what's right in front of you at the moment. The work that you are engaged in. He says, we can find satisfaction in that. Meaning, something that's going to last forever. He says, meaning might be out of reach, actually. But we can enjoy and be satisfied in our work. Satisfaction in our life is something that God has ordained. So we're going to, with sort of those thoughts in mind, we're going to dive into chapter 3 because it's got a few things to say to us, I think, as we think about looking ahead and thinking post-pandemic. The first one that comes to us right off the top there from that famous, or that passage made famous by the Beatles, for those of us that are old enough to know that song, is simply that every season is God ordained. There's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. We might not like hearing that, that this last 16 months has actually been part of God's plan. We kind of were hoping that was the theological fart, right? Oh, we can just forget about that and carry on. No, God's ordained this too, this season of time. In every aspect of our existence, even in every aspect of the created world, Ecclesiastes doesn't so much teach us God's sovereignty as it does assume it. If you're reading through the whole book, it's interesting. The preacher really comes at it from this profound sense of the idea that God is in control. He's the king of the universe, and there's nothing we can do to really change that fact. His actions towards us are often described without any recourse on the part of the individual. So God does something, and there's nothing we can do about it. He's more powerful than we are. Everything is in his control. And often the control is expressed through God's unquestioned authority to assess the character of his creation, to know whether the thing he has created is good or bad. We skipped over it, but verse 18 says this. He says, I also said to myself, as for humans, God tests them so that they may see that they are like the animals. Again, not a super happy thought, but God... it displays his sovereignty in bringing us experiences and seasons that we might not choose ourselves. And it leaves us with questions often. All of life leaves us with questions when you think about it. I have 4 young boys, so the questions come fast and fierce. Why is an orange the color orange? Well, it might be the dog chasing its own tail there. But we're always filled with questions, whatever stage of life we're at. I kind of found myself actually, it wasn't an initial, the first few weeks of February, but as we kind of got accustomed to my father-in-law being gone, I kind of started thinking about, he was only 65. Why do the good ones go so early? Why do bad things happen to good people? Laura in the hospital. For what reason? We probably all have questions about bat physiology and why do they have to have such strong immune systems that they get people sick when you go near them and they start pandemics. And I think it's okay to ponder those a little bit because we're still, they seem simplistic, and yet, science is really good at telling us the how these things have happened, and we're thankful for that. Advances in science, get us to a vaccine within a year of this thing spreading around the world. So we're thankful for that. But Ecclesiastes maybe answers a bit more of the why question. Why are things the way they are? Well, it's because God has ordained it. So God has said or made it this way. Now, I think the preacher of the book of Ecclesiastes knows that's kind of an unsatisfying answer, actually. Why is an orange orange? Well, God made it that way. It's kind of opaque. It answers the question, but not in a way that sort of draws us deeper into it. It keeps us at the surface, as it were. And Ecclesiastes, he goes, the author of that says, I went through all kinds of rigors trying to sort these things out. And as though he's trying to spare us sort of painful and fruitless philosophizing. He says there's no end there. There's no satisfaction to be found in trying to drag answers out of this. We just have to accept sometimes that this is the way God has made it. Well, carrying on with happy messages, the next thing we can kind of observe from chapter 3 is that every task is futile. Everything you can engage in this world is meaningless. Meaningless. Everything is meaningless, he says. And chapter 3 repeats this theme. If you look through these pairings, it's very poetic the way the author arranges this, but notice how every pair is a precise opposite. There's a time to tear and a time to mend. There's a time to be silent and a time to speak. Some of these things are of our choosing. We might choose to do one thing one day and choose to do the opposite another day, but some of them are beyond us as well, beyond our choice. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot. Some of these are reflecting the God-ordained seasons of our lives. And as I said, the idea that every task we can engage in is futile is not a terribly happy thought. The idea that everything we do, we may be forced in a day or two, or a week, a month, a year to turn around and undo it. Or maybe to be undoing the work of somebody else. And I kind of anticipate we might be in that place post-pandemic. That there are some things that we've gotten, and probably some of us are probably really hoping that's going to take place. We're going to get used to putting on a mask every time we go to work and suddenly have to train ourselves not to do that. And we're going to engage, we're going to savor that futility a bit. But to say that everything is futile seems almost nihilistic. That's a fancy word just to say that nihilism is the belief that everything is leading to nothing. That there's no reason to life. There's no greater meaning. It's all just, heading toward a fart. And nihilism is prevalent throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. And it's not just sort of like we might think of that thought as like kind of like emotionalism, like, oh, I'm just feeling sad or depressed, and so I just don't see any point in life. But the book of Ecclesiastes is not emotional about it. It's cold and calculating. It's very logical in its approach. The author of Ecclesiastes in chapter 6, verses 3 to 6, puts it this way, just as an example. He says this: a man may have 100 children and live many years. Yet no matter how long he lives, if he cannot enjoy his prosperity and does not receive a proper burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. It comes without meaning, it departs in darkness, and in darkness its name is shrouded. Though it never saw the sun or knew anything, it has more rest than does that man. even if he lives 1,000 years, twice over, but fails to enjoy his prosperity? Do not all go to the same place? I don't remember studying the book of Ecclesiastes in Sunday school for some reason. Happy thoughts, all of them. But I wonder if it's maybe something that God overlooked. I think in some ways this book is something that young Christians and other people of our generation need to hear. You think of Canada and the prevalence of youth suicide especially. It's a major cause of youth mortality in our country. Seems like many people arrive at the conclusion of the preacher, but they don't get to the next step of realizing the hope that is in God and the gospel. They just understand the futility of life and don't see anything more. I think the church has a compelling message to offer in that moment, to infuse hope, to say there is actually something broader going on, but it's not going to come through the work of your hands necessarily. I think sometimes we're reticent to go there, though. It's a pretty dark place to say, yeah, actually there's a lot of futility in life. It's pervasive. It's everywhere. And I think a lot of Christians actually shy away from the book of Ecclesiastes just for that reason. There's so many times he says meaningless, meaningless. It's in every chapter of the book. But I think if we can't face the darkness in that book of Scripture, we're going to have a hard time facing it in the human soul. The nihilism of Ecclesiastes is uncomfortable precisely because its logic is unassailable. But it's not the last word, and so we have to read this portion with an eye to the conclusion. Yes, there's a time for being born and a time for killing. There's a time to die. Everything finds its moment to be undone, but we have to keep an eye for the end of the book. Chapter 9, verse 4 says this: anyone who is among the living has hope. It's better to be a living dog than a dead lion. That's verse 4 of chapter 9. Our days are conflictual and contradictory. Every task we can approach has some element of futility in it. But that futility, the author tells us, does not negate the necessity of doing those things or finding satisfaction in them even. I don't need to tell you anything about futility in the days of the pandemic. You feel like sometimes I think we all have days where we wonder, am I just spinning my wheels here? Like, are we getting any further ahead? Is there any sense of progress in my life, or are we just kind of stuck? Thinking of oranges this week, even while we were on vacation, I noticed something that, as I realize, is becoming a bit of a pattern with my youngest. We like getting the little mandarin oranges because, for little kids, it's a nice size of fruit or whatever. So then even for Argyle, ostensibly he could eat that entire thing, but I've realized that his habit now is actually not to eat it. But he's the most excited person in our family when the oranges come out after a meal, a bit of fruit for dessert. And he's the first one in there. He looks through it and he grabs his favorite orange and he holds it close, but he can't actually peel it himself. So he usually comes and gives it to me, and still not a lot of words yet. So there's like a lot of non-verbal communication, and I figure out he wants me to peel it for him. So I'll sit him on my lap, and I'll hold it in front of him so he can watch me peeling it. And I try to. My usual is the little elephant design with the peel. That's about the only one I know and can do consistently. So I get all done, and then as soon as it's peeled, I've noticed the habit is I'll break it apart so he can have one little segment, and then he hops off and runs away. So I'm left with this orange. It's like, well, I hope I wanted one because... And I remember, actually, I think Leaf used to do this a bit when he was quite young. And I think, like, first-time parent, you stress over things that are unnecessary. But now with Argyle, I realize it's like, no, I got 4 kids. Or worst comes worst, I'll probably eat it. Like, it's not going to do me any harm. And that frustration kind of ebbed away a bit because I realized, no, I get to actually just enjoy this quiet moment with this kid who normally wouldn't sit on my lap for that long, and just peel an orange together, and that's what we're gonna do. And yeah, there's some futility to it. I know he's not going to eat the orange, but I'm going to do it anyway. And so there's some necessity, because if I don't peel that orange, then the waterworks, well, not the waterworks, it's more the siren begins. So I might as well just embrace it. I might as well just do it and enjoy it, and enjoy the little moment as a father and son together. And that's, I think, part of the way of where the preacher is pushing us. He says, yes, every task is futile, but just because something's futile doesn't mean you don't have to do it. It doesn't eliminate the necessity, and it doesn't have to eliminate satisfaction from it either. I think it's really easy, especially in the book of Ecclesiastes, to see fatalism. That's the belief that, okay, God ordains everything, and so it really doesn't matter what I do. It's actually a very common part of the Muslim world view. They have a phrase, inshallah. It means essentially it's as God has ordained, and there's nothing I can do about it. And so there's sort of a passivity that comes from it. We're going to sit back and watch life just happen, and there's nothing we can do to change what God has done. And while it's true that God's power is way beyond ours, there is sort of this idea of fate running throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. It does not exist apart from some very intentional acts on God's part, of including us in his creation, of ordering his universe and the episodes of our lives so that we can participate in life as well in a meaningful way. We read verse 11. He's made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from the beginning to the end. We have this ache for eternity, for something beyond ourselves, and yet we can't fathom the things that God is doing. Though he cannot be thwarted, there's still room for us to exercise our own will and make our own choices. And I appreciate that Ecclesiastes affirms that. He says, as long as you're living, there's something that you can do. You can have hope. You can have hope. We can all do something. I think that was a favorite sort of church-wide program I saw a few years back by a preacher down in California. You get into all these like church-wide plans, 40 days of focus or 40 days of purpose from Saddleback or whatever. His was really simple. He said, do something. We're going to take 40 days and just do something. Like I remember actually hearing him preach on this subject, and it was that simple. It was like, I really don't care what. Just do something good in your neighborhood. Just do something. And I thought, yeah, that's kind of the message of Ecclesiastes. Do something. Do something good. Engage. There are longings within our hearts that may be impossible to satisfy. Eternity is there, the author says, but God's sovereign rule does not turn us into rats in a laboratory maze. We're not just here to kind of run through the hoops and jump through it for no reason whatsoever. He's put us on this planet for a reason. Actually, Peter affirms that in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, in one of his sermons. It's Paul. Sorry, Paul affirms that. He quotes saying, God has figured out where we're going to live and the times we're going to be alive. And it's all for a reason. God has put it together for a reason. So it's not fatalism to say, okay, God's in control, so I can just give up. But there is, I think, in Ecclesiastes sort of some stark realism, almost bordering on cynicism, to say God is in control and I'm not. So I have this little slice of life, this little bit of energy that I can expend, and I should do it wisely. I have this little space within my life that I can control, and I ought to do something good with it. So let's apply that a little bit. Think about that for a minute. As we go through the pandemic, we realize there's a lot that we cannot change, actually. As much as I would like to be able to rewrite the restrictions that come out every couple of weeks or whatever, that's beyond my control. It's not something that I can do anything about. But I can deal with things that I can control. What am I doing right now that leads me into a place of satisfaction before God? of living rightly with him, doing the good work that he has given me to do. I think another thing we can think about is planning ahead. We're putting our minds into this idea of, there's going to be a sort of a post-pandemic moment. What do we need to do now to be prepared for that moment? I think sometimes when our minds go there, the emotional response is actually just worry. We get into either realizing, okay, I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't anticipate everything that's going to happen, and therefore there's no reason to plan because I don't know all the variables. That's just worry. That's beyond our control. Planning is saying, okay, what do I need to do today so that I am ready tomorrow? And so sometimes, as we go through these moments, we need to think about that. One thing that's, I think, become apparent to me over the years is time management in some ways. I don't think in some ways we've gotten beyond the parable of the Good Samaritan in the evangelical church anyway. I think often our picture of a good Christian, a good follower of Jesus Christ, is somebody who's spending like 30 hours inside of a church building every week. And it's like, no, actually, those are the bad guys in that parable of the Good Samaritan. It's the people that had to get to church, that had to get to Jerusalem. They were too busy. They had too many things to do on their schedule to stop for somebody who was obviously in distress beside the road. The priest, he had important functions. The Levite, he had work that needed doing there. They had good excuses, actually, was the thing. And I think we need to think about our time differently. If we think about our time as always, well, I have something else booked here that I shouldn't give up to do this other thing. Or maybe my time is too important to attend to this random stranger who's crossed my path. That's often usually more the one that I gravitate to. And I hope in the sort of the post-pandemic world, we're, as followers of Christ, going to manage our time in such a way to, even if we do, in a year end up finding ourselves just as busy before, we can at least think about our time in a different way to say, yeah, I am busy, but I'm not so busy or so important that I can't stop and be a friend to this person that God has directed into my path. I always come back to Ephesians chapter 2, that God is preparing good works for us ahead of time, that we might walk in them. That to me speaks of a choice. But the conclusion of the matter that Ecclesiastes brings us to in chapter 3 and at the end of the book is simply this, that we need to enjoy our work and be satisfied in it. We read the last verse that sort of resounds with that in chapter 3. So I saw that there's nothing better for a person than to enjoy their work, because that is their lot. For who can bring them to see what will happen after them? While meaning often proves elusive in our life, we can be satisfied in what God has set right in front of us. We're directed to find satisfaction in our existence, our work, our family, our home. And as we've heard pointed out from chapter 6, there's a lot of people that never find satisfaction there. They have all these things laid out in front of them, and yet they don't pause to enjoy them. We were just talking before the service. I remember a friend who had always gone, south of the border somewhere for her holidays, and sort of last minute that year, this was years ago, was unable to. It wasn't pandemic time yet. And so she said, actually, we had a really nice staycation. She said, I realized actually we'd done a major project in our backyard every year for a decade and never once taken holidays just to enjoy that space. We were always just working in it. And so she said it was really nice just to kind of sit on the deck. I had a gorgeous deck, she says. I barely used it. We're always running off to some other place, right? Summer's usually my favorite season in Alberta, and yet, how often do we find ourselves fleeing the country at that point? Lots of people are given things but fail to savor them, says the preacher. The tone of this book can be dark, but I think if we read it rightly, the net result should actually be a lightness of heart, a gladness, a joy. You get to the end of the book and it's like, yeah, we've gone through some kind of dark passages, but you get to chapter 12 and he just states it so simply. He says the culmination, the only appropriate response to everything that's gone before in the previous 12 chapters of Ecclesiastes, remember your Creator in your youth. While you're young, while you have energy to engage in the work that he's given, remember your Creator. This is the ultimate fulfillment of every command to find satisfaction in your toil and circumstances. The reality is, I think, as we look at sort of post-pandemic, how are we going to live wisely in that period? Let's not defer satisfaction. Let's not defer enjoyment of what God has given us. And let's not defer obedience to God. All of those things, I think, are foolish propositions when we put them off. But we have to take all of that together, too. Jesus talks very explicitly about that in one of his parables in Luke chapter 12. It's called the parable of the rich fool. And it's a really short story. It's a guy who does really well on his harvest, decides, I think I need to build bigger barns to hold all of this. And God says, you're an idiot, you're going to die. The end. Pretty stark tale. It's always struck me, but actually I think it fits pretty well with the book of Ecclesiastes when you think about it. We're to enjoy life. Don't get Jesus wrong, and don't hear only meaningless from the preacher of Ecclesiastes. We're to enjoy life and find satisfaction in it. But that's not to the exclusion of serving other people as well. It's not to the exclusion, even in our minds, of planning our lives as though God doesn't exist, as though we're in total control. We're supposed to think about our lives and hold them loosely. Wise is the person who can acknowledge that God is the giver of satisfaction, of the desires of one's heart, and that to remain in right relationship with one's Creator is the highest good to which anyone can strive in this life. Have you been doing that during the pandemic? I know I've been missing it quite a few days. It's really easy, I think, when you're in isolation, in some sense, to kind of just look out for number one. Like, take care of me and my own, right? And it just takes a lot more effort to kind of get beyond our own wants, desires, and needs and think about those of other people, doesn't it? Especially when we're in this place of being disconnected. Well, I think we want to be then intentional sort of in the post-pandemic world, saying we're going to be in a place of being connected again. Let's use those connections. Let's serve one another. Let's love each other. As I kind of pause with this message, this thinking about this futility, I realized, you know what? It's not just that life sometimes is futile. Sometimes I'm the maker of my own futility too, and I need to repent of that before God. That as hard as I pursue God's righteousness with my life, sometimes I'm at the same time with my left hand undermining it just as quickly. There's futility in the unrighteousness I pursue. And I think the marvelous grace of God, of Jesus, is that God chooses to use us anyway, to work through us despite all of the futility that we engage in. It's even in the book of Ecclesiastes, I think. It says, as you do not know the path of the wind, or how the body is formed in a mother's womb, so you cannot understand the work of God, the maker of all things. That's Ecclesiastes 11, verse 5. There's a reality that God is doing something wonderful in our world, but beyond our reckoning even. And he's working through broken creatures like us, bent and warped tools to fashion his creation into something that he wants it to be. I think in some ways it's kind of like that moment where Moses is on Mount Sinai. He says, God, I want to look on you and see what you're like. And God says, well, no, you can look at the back of me. That's about as close as you're going to get. And it's because I think to observe God in all of his glory, that's we think of light as illuminating, but it's also something that blinds as well. And I think that's where Moses kind of gets up. To see God's glory in all of its marvel and wonder would be blinding. So Ecclesiastes says, don't let that depress you. That you can't fathom all of God. He says, no, just marvel at the things that are in front of you. Find satisfaction in your work. Enjoy this life. Interestingly, what do we walk away with here at the end from this message? Well, we want to walk in wisdom, obviously. We want to choose the right path. I love chapter 7 because there's a few verses, 15 to 18. Interestingly, he kind of comes to a halfway conclusion in chapter 7, and he says, well, I looked at all the good moral people out there and all the wicked people and realized that they all kind of had the same common lot. But if you're really a terrible person, like, it's not going to go well with you. He's kind of, I think, blending in with Proverbs and the other wisdom literature at that point to say, yeah, it doesn't make sense to be excessively wicked. But he says, on the other hand, it doesn't really pay to be excessively righteous either. He says, no, there's a moderate way in the middle, actually. You want to walk before God as though he exists, as though he's real, knowing that walking with him is the wisest way in life. But he says, don't throw yourself into wholly into wickedness, and don't try to be the perfect person, somebody that you're not either. Thinking of the foolishness of wickedness, being a youth pastor for 11 years gives you a few examples over the years. So the guilty will remain nameless. But I remember we had one kid in our youth group, and his family had a strict rule about watching movies. And it was whatever the rating on it, like the age rating, applied firmly to whoever was watching it. So if you were not 13, you could not watch a PG-13 movie. It was just very cut and dry that way. And so this eldest son turned 17. And I asked him how his birthday went. He was like, oh, it's pretty good. I was like, so what did you do last weekend? He was like, oh, I was binging R-rated movies. I was like, what? Because they were pretty straight-laced family. And he's like, oh yeah, well, I turned 17, so I was allowed to watch an R-rated movie now, because you can't watch it if you're 16 and under. And his mom was standing right there. She's like, yeah, no, he's 17 now. He can make his own decisions. And so this went on, actually, for a couple weeks. Like, he'd been compiling a list for, like, the last few years of all these R-rated movies that he'd been missing out on. But he got to the end. I said, so, what did you think of all that? He says, well, yeah, there was one or two, I'm glad I got to see now, But he said, on the whole, I probably didn't miss much. In fact, if I missed anything, it was probably a couple things over the last couple weeks when I was busy watching movies that I could have been living life with. And it just kind of struck me. It's like, yeah, you can throw yourself into whatever, R-rated movies or whatever, and waste your life that way. And I think too, as I was talking about time management before, it's like, I can be 60 hours in the church building praying and scrubbing the windows or whatever. It's like all of those are good things, but maybe we need to moderate it and find satisfaction in life. Maybe we need to moderate it and find things that we can find joy in. So what can we take away from this passage? Well, we ought to, the idea of seasons to me strikes that we ought to reflect on the past. That we shouldn't just come through a season and take nothing away from it. I hope we come out of the pandemic a little bit wiser for having been through it. But we also ought to plan for the future. There's this idea that God has ordained every season. That there is a shift in season coming. The pandemic isn't going to be forever. So let's be prepared for that next move. Maybe it's going to include a life change for us, moving to a new house, finding a new job. Maybe it's going to be a new addition to your family, whether through kids or grandkids or through marriage. All of these things keep happening, and these seasons in life keep coming at us. So the message is enjoy your current season of life, even knowing that maybe some of it's going to be undone. I've been, I think, at one wedding where, you kind of hear some of the gossip off in the corner or whatever about, they're not going to last or whatever. It's like, whatever. Like, it's a wedding. Let's be happy for these people. Let's bless them. And the marriage counseling can come later. Probably needs to for more people than get it. So enjoy your current season of life. Handle it with its tensions and its contradictions, and anticipate them, and know that that's okay. I think at the end of it all, we just need to have, in a sense, humility in all endeavors to say, God, you're in control. I'm not. But you've given me this little slice of the pie, some energy, some time on this earth, some resources to do something good, and help me to find satisfaction in the life that you've given me. Let's take a moment and pray. Almighty King, God of the universe, our Creator, we acknowledge that you have made us. We are your people. We are your children, Lord. You know us inside and out. You know all our ways. You know why you put us here on this earth for this time and this place, Lord. And not all of that is known to us. There's still a lot of mystery to this life, Lord. And so we just pray that we would accept that humbly from your hand, Lord. That in the days and weeks and months ahead, and particularly looking forward to this time of being sort of post-pandemic and reconnecting with people, Lord, we pray that we would walk in that time with purpose. Not trying to be super spiritual or squeeze meaning out of everyday conversations that maybe aren't, it just isn't there, Lord, but to find satisfaction in the goodness you've given us, in conversing and connecting with friends, Lord, and in doing the work that you've put before us, in walking in the good works and good things that you've planned ahead of time for us. And so, Lord, we just pray that we would embrace your plan for our lives, Lord. And we acknowledge we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know the future, but we do know that you do. And so, Lord, we trust you. And we want to tell you that this evening, Lord, that we trust you. And we know that you are a good God to us. And so we look forward with hope and anticipation in what you're going to do in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen.